Hi guys, hope you all doing well, and this is the third video of the entire series that I will be creating for SaaS applications. And in this video, I'm going to talk about how you can register an application in Azure Active Directory that you are developing that can be either specifically for your tenant or it can be a multi-tenant application. What is a service principal object and an application object and how they are created the moment you register an application in Azure AD. How to check the current consent that is mapped for one particular application, and how you can manage or remove the consent for a particular application, and that too user specific. So for every user who is consenting the application, there will be a consent object that will be created. I will be showing you that as well with the help of PowerShell. But before we move on with the entire demonstration of how exactly things work under the hood, let's consider a simple scenario wherein I'm going to add an application in Azure Active Directory. And the moment I will add the application to Azure Active Directory, an application object will be created for that particular application. Now, this object has certain attributes which will be there, or which will be, what should I say, by design. And this is moreover referred as schema and current configuration. This could be the logo, this could be the sign-in URL of your application, and certain attributes from this particular application will be used to create a service principal object for your particular tenant. So in your tenant, apart from getting an application object created, a service principal object is also created. Now, service principal object can be considered as a security principal with which all the permissions will be mapped in terms of accessing any resource that is protected by Azure AD. So some of the attributes that belong to application object will remain same in the service principal object, but there will be new attributes, or there will be different attributes as well. Since both the objects belong to a different class, that itself signifies that they have a different purpose, and how these two objects work together, starting from getting your user authenticated from Azure Active Directory to access a protected resource, like Graph or any Exchange Online API or any API that's been protected by Azure AD itself. So this will be a complete demo in terms of getting things configured on the portal itself. So let me quickly switch to portal.azure.com. So here I'm logged in into portal.azure.com, and I've clicked on Azure Active Directory, and then I'm into app registration. Before you proceed for adding any of the application in your tenant, the best part which I can suggest you, or what you can also check, is the endpoint list. Now, as you can see that the very first option that you get here is the federation metadata. So the moment you will navigate to this particular link, what you will see is the federation metadata that is specific to your tenant, a list of the claims that can be issued by Azure AD, some of the information moreover related to the endpoints that can be used, what will be the issuer that you see the moment you will receive any token from Azure AD, some of the WS Fed endpoints which can be used by a WS Fed application, or some SAML P endpoints. Moreover, some information also related to Graph, as well as OAuth to authorization endpoint, as well as token endpoint. But the application that I'm going to use for this particular demo will be a OpenID Connect application, and there is an endpoint which you can also access to check more details about the OpenID well-known configuration. So if you are developing a multi-tenant application, I would suggest you to use the information that is mentioned on the common endpoint, because then the redirection part based on the UPN of your user will be taken care by login.microsoftonline.com itself. So the common endpoints are basically used for multi-tenant application. And if you are developing an application that's moreover related to your particular tenant, then what you can do is you can replace this common value with your tenant name. So the moment you will now navigate to this link of well-known OpenID configuration, it will show you the information that's moreover related to your tenant specifically. So this is how it will look, and these are the different parameters which can be used by different scope of your application by doing a different purpose. Let's say you want to access some of the protected resource by graph, or if you're implementing moreover a function in terms of checking the session iframe. So these are the different things or different endpoints which can be used depending upon the scope of your application. Now let's go back to the app registration page, and here what we'll do is we'll register or we'll create an application. So the moment you will click on new application, these are the three options which you get. On the very first one, let's name this application as OpenID Connect Test. And as you can see now, I'm getting two options: web app API and a native. These are the two options that you will get by default. The only change that you will observe the moment I will switch to native is the sign-on URL will get changed to redirect URI. Now, this is something which is by design because every application works in a different way. So there are certain set of attributes which needs to be populated on a particular application object. So since I'm using a web app for this demo, I'll be selecting the first option, and the demo that I'll be using, or the application that I'll be using, I have downloaded this from a GitHub site, and I will be sharing that link in the description as well. What you can do is you can also download the same application, configure as I'm configuring right now, so that we all can be on the same page and we all can understand how exactly this consent framework is working under the hood. So the moment I will click on create, in simple terms, a application is created now. Now, as I said before, whenever you register an application, a service principal object and an application object is created. Application object is again the schema, and service principal object is again something with which the entire permissions of the applications are binded. Now, the information that you see here is the application object. Now, how am I saying this is I'm using the Azure AD preview module of Azure Active Directory, and I'm running a command which is Azure get-Azure AD application, and the first result that I will be getting here will be the same application, OpenID Connect Test App. There is a typo in OpenID Connect, but it's fine. Okay, so this is the same application object which we see here. Now, if I do get-Azure AD service principal, and if I will search for an application named as Open, I should get the service principal object associated with this particular application. Now, why am I saying associated with this particular application is in the results that you get, you have to map or you have to check that the app ID of the service principal object and the application object should be same, because this is the attribute which is actually binding the two objects. Now, if you want to go ahead and check every attribute of the application object or a service principal object, what you can do is you can run the same command, and you can format the list of the object, and you will see everything getting listed on the PowerShell itself. Now, if we saw these properties by the ascending order of their name, what you will observe that whatever information you see here will be same information that will be listed in the manifest file of your application object. I repeat, the information that you get by running get-azure AD application will be the identical information that you will see in the manifest file of your application object. Now let's go back to PowerShell and run the same command for the service principal object. Now if we do get hyphen Azure AD service principal object, and if we format the list, see this is the set of options, this is the set of attributes which are populated by default. Now, as I was saying before, that the service principal object uses certain attributes that are associated with your application object. A simple example which we can consider here is home page. So as you can see, for my service principal object, the home page is https localhost 44320. It will be the same for my application object as well. So this is how it goes in terms of checking the attributes associated with these two different objects. And as you can also see that there is an attribute called tags in the service principal object, which is not there in the application object. So there are certain attribute value which will match between the application object as well as the service principal object. But since these two objects belong to a different class, they will have their own different set of attributes as well. Now we have checked the schema part of the application object. Now let's go ahead and check how the permissions are mapped with the service principal object. Now for that, what we need to do is uh, to we have to configure a redirect on our application that should go to login.microsoftonline.com. In this template which we have downloaded, it's there by default. All you need to do is you have to get the app ID. You can copy this either from the list that you get for service principal or from the list that you get for application object as well, and update that app ID in the client ID field in your application itself. Now, the moment you will update this, I would suggest you to rebuild the solution so that there should be nothing cached in terms of the previous configuration. And in the tenant, do mention your default domain name. In my case, it's labboc.onmicrosoft.com. And don't make any changes to these two parameters which we see here. Now, what I'll do is I will run the application. And the moment I will click on sign in, I should be redirected to login.microsoftonline.com with some set of parameters presented in the scope, which I will be discussing later in the same video. So the moment I will click on sign in, I'm redirected to login.microsoftonline.com. Now, these are the accounts that belongs to my tenant, and I can use any one of them to sign in. So I'm choosing the account which is peter@conceptswork.com. Now, the moment I will click on sign in, I will be presented with the consent prompt. Now, this consent is a kind of acknowledgement which the user has to approve, which is making sure that yes, the user is aware of what the application is going to access. Now, if I will click on accept, I will be landed back to my application. But before that, I would like to show something more, and that is the permissions. The moment you will add any application in your tenant, there is a permission which is granted by default, and that is of accessing user profile, the signed in user profile. And this is something which is used by login.microsoftonline.com in order to generate claims and send back to the application. So this is the permission which is there by default. And as you can see, we are getting here the option of sign in and read user profile. This is the same option which we are getting here in the consent prompt as well. Let me cancel this and close this. So this is Windows Azure Active Directory is something with which the information will be requested on a specific API. Let's say my application wants to access some more information for Exchange. So what I'll do is I'll go here and I'll select the Exchange Online API, and I will select those permissions which might not require admin consent to understand things more easily. Now, one more thing which is really important, which I would like to cover, that as we can see, there are two options here: application permissions and delegated permissions. I will be sharing an article which has been published by Microsoft itself, which specifically lists the difference between this permission, between application permission and delegated permission. So these permissions are basically used in the model wherein your application is using client ID and client key credentials. That means the authentication piece or the request to access the protected resource is not done in the user context. In our case, the application that I'm going to use is based on user context, so I'll be making changes in the delegated permissions itself. So I'll click on select, and as you can see that there are three more permissions which I'm granting to this particular application. So this means what? Next time when this user will come and log in, he or she should get the acknowledgement or the consent prompt to approve these three requests as well. So I'll go ahead and sign in with the same user, and let's see if we find any difference in terms of the consent prompt that we were getting before. So we used Peter account, and we'll use again the same account, and let's see if there is a consent change that we are receiving from login.microsoftonline.com or not. And yes, it's there. So the changes that you're going to make here in the permissions tab, that will reflect in onto the consent prompt which a user is getting. So this was about the permissions of the applications. Now let's talk about what will happen once the user will accept this consent. The moment the user will accept this consent, he or she should be landed back to the application, which is happening right now. But now there are many changes which are being done under the hood. Let's go through them step by step. So there is a consent which is being approved by one of my user, and that belongs to my directory. So how do I check that? For that, I can simply use the command get-azure AD auth to permission grant, and this will list the consent objects that belong to my directory. Now, consent object is a reference that login.microsoftonline.com needs to approve the access for a particular application accessing a protected resource. But from this particular list, it's not clear that which is the consent which John has approved, or which is the consent that belongs to the application which we have just added. So in order to check information application is specific, auth permission application is specific, what we need to do is we have to run this command which says get-azure AD service principal auth to permission grant, and we are going to use the object ID of our service principal object. So I'll copy this, I'll run this, and you can see that these are the two consent objects that are created for John. Now we know this, and our scope of information is very limited because we have used only one account. But again, if you want to check, let's say something that has been approved, that too by user specific, what you can do is you can run this command which says get-azure AD user auth to permission grant, and here what you need to do is you have to use the object ID of the user for which you want to check the information. So we can check the consent information at the directory level, at the application level, and at the user level as well. So we have used John's account, or we have used Peter's. We'll quickly check. Yeah. So we'll go back and check the object ID of Peter. And the moment we'll now apply a filter, what we'll see is the two consent objects that actually referencing to our service principal, they are being consented by Peter. Now I'll go back to my application and I will use a different user object and I will consent the application again. And what we'll see is the difference in this particular list. Over here, there will be four entries, two of them belonging to each user. And then we'll go ahead and check for two users respectively what is the consent objects getting listed. So I'll go back to my application. I'll stop this and I'll again log in now, and this time with John's account. So again, since this is a new user who will be accessing the application for the very first time, there should be a consent prompt presented to John as well. This time we'll use John and we'll sign in and we should get a consent prompt. Perfect. That's what we are getting. Now let's go back to Azure AD and let's take John's object ID and let's go back to PowerShell. Now what we'll do is we'll do get hyphen Azure AD user auth permission grant and we'll check the grant that's been done by John. So for the same application, two different users have accepted the consent and you can see there are two different consent objects created for each user. Now what we can do is we can go ahead and check the same value for the service principal object. So what we'll do now is we'll do get hyphen Azure AD service principal auth grant and here we should get four options. Correct. We are getting four objects getting listed here. Now we have seen how to customize permission so that there is a different set of consent prompt being displayed to the user. We have seen how you can go ahead and check the consent at the directory level by using get-azure AD auth to permission grant. We have checked how you can use how you can check the consent at the service principal at the application object level, that by using get-azure AD service principal auth to permission grant. And we can also check at the same at at the user level. So what for that what we can do is we can do get-azure AD auth to get-azure AD user auth to permission grant. But now let's say that for some reason you want any of the user to get consented again, or there is some sort of suspicious activity happening, or for any reason you want to remove the consent for an application or for a specific user. What you can go ahead is what you can do is you can go ahead and use this command of remove hyphen Azure AD or to permission grant, and then you can choose the object ID of a particular user or a particular application, and you can just remove that consent and that will be removed. If it is user specific, it will be removed from user. If it is a directory specific consent that's been given, that will also get removed. So we have removed the one which says MX, and this is something that belongs to Peter. So if we'll remove the other one as well, which is this one, then Peter should get the consent once again. So we have removed both the consents, and now there should be only two consent getting listed here. Perfect. We'll go back to our application. We'll sign out from here and we'll try signing in with Peter's account and see if we are getting the consent prompt again or not. And this time I will also be using a Fiddler to trace the authentication request or to trace the authentication process that's happening, so that we all can be on the same page. And you can also go ahead and check, and you can also look for the different parameters that can be used by different applications depending upon the authentication flow that you are implementing. So I've clicked on sign in and I'll try signing in with Peter's account, and let's see if I get the consent prompt again. No, I'm not getting the consent prompt. So that means that I might have removed the values from John's account. So what we'll do is we'll try signing in again, and let's see if we get the consent prompt. It takes some time to get these objects removed from the backend. So that could be a reason why the consent was not presented. But the moment you will remove any of the consent object uh, for a particular user, that particular user will be presented with the consent prompt. So in our case, it was John account. It's my bad. I got confused with both the accounts. So John is now again getting presented for the consent, though he has already approved this before. So the moment I will click on accept, again those two objects will be created and will be mapped to the service principal as well as the user object. Now let's go back to my application and let's see what happened on the application side and how did the authentication work. So this is the Fiddler trace that I have captured. Let's talk about the account for Peter itself. That my application redirected Peter to login.microsoftonline.com with the specific scopes. And here it is mentioned OpenID profile. You can go through with the article which says implementing OpenID with Azure AD, and there it will be listed which attributes can be used in the authentication request. And here itself, the token is being given to the application. And in order to see the claims and the token, what you can do is you can log into jwt.io and you can mention or you can just decrypt this particular information that you have got from Fiddler, and it will show you the list of all the attributes for that particular user object. So yes, Peter is the object that I've used, and Peter at the concepts work was my UPN. So this was all about how consent frameworks work. User will go to the application will redirect the user to Azure AD login endpoint depending upon the application, depending upon the protocol that you are using, but in common it will be the authorized endpoint itself. The difference will be in the scope that you are requesting. Once the user is successfully authenticated, login.microsoftonline.com will check for the respective consent. If required, yes or no. If it is approved, then the user has the access. If it is not approved, the user will be presented with the consent prompt. Once the user has consented, depending upon the APIs, different consent objects will be created, which will be mapped to the user object as well as to the service principal object. Four commands that you can use to go ahead and check what is the difference or what are the different requirements, how you at which level you want to remove the consent are get-azure AD Oauth to permission grant. This is something that will give you the information at the directory level. This is something which is related to the service principal object itself of your application. The next the next one is which will list the details for users, and again you can remove the consent as required. So this was all about how the consent framework works or how the authentication works whenever you register an application. So the demo that I was showing was moreover related to an application that is related to your tenant. Now, let's say you want to make your application multi-tenant. What you can do is you can navigate to the application object of your of the particular application which you have added, and there is a simple change which you have to in the manifest file, and then your application will become multi-tenant app. So I'll click on manifest, and now I will go here, and it's already a multi-tenant app. So available to other tenants, if it is set to true, you will see that this option, delete option, will not be listed. So the moment I will do this to false, now this application is scoped to my tenant only, and now I'm getting the delete option as well. So in order to delete an application which you have in your directory, which is a multi-tenant app, you have to convert that application, put the scope to your tenant only, and then you only will be able to delete that particular application. So this was all about how the consent framework works. If you guys have any questions, please do reach out to me at learnconceptswork@gmail.com. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Bye bye.